Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We're going to talk about our Parents You Matter workshop that the TYSA Coalition jointly developed. This is a strategy that was really led by initially what was called our social norms work group and morphed into a community messaging work group, but is now sustained and continued in our school-based work group. And what we really try to do with this strategy is to train fellow partners. We want as many folks comfortable with delivering this workshop as possible. And we really encourage partners to deliver this to parents and caregivers that they're serving at their orgs, but then also be available to, occasionally co-present with Ashley or myself when we hear from partners like schools often request this workshop. So we hope you'll consider also making yourself available to co-present with us as requests come in. And that I find also is John, who's here, has often co-presented with me, and it's an opportunity while you're there to also pitch some of the work happening at your org, right? Like you don't have to confine yourself to this script, but it is a kind of a foundation of what to cover. And I think it's all the more value when you can bring in experiences that you're having at your organizations, plugging services that are available in your organizations. I've co-delivered a couple times with we've co-delivered with problem gambling, we've co-delivered with the district attorney's office, and those are all like really unique perspectives that can be added to the conversation. And so don't feel like you're confined to the script. Ashley, do you want to add like anything else before we kind of like launch into it?
So I think we can kind of go into the content and kind of keep the dialogue going as we go through some of the material. So next slide. So usually we start off the presentation just introducing, the two presenters, what each of our roles are, what brought us to, what brings us to the presentation. So for example, when Sean and I do the presentation, we each explain, that we are staff at SAPCW and our roles in TYSA. So that just informs, the perspective that we're coming from when we deliver the information. And we do an overview about, what we are going to cover today so people know what to expect. And basically the presentation is broken down into these 5 categories. We start after the intro, just giving parents information about what the substance landscape looks like on Staten Island. So they're aware of any kind of trends, who's using what, things like that. And within that, we do talk a little bit about some of the reasons why teens are using TU based on the data that we have. And then we talk a little bit about the significance, of parents and caregivers. I think a lot of parents tend to think, oh, my teen or my kid is not going to listen to me, right? They don't think I'm cool. Like they don't really think they have a role in these discussions. So we encourage them that they actually do have a role, and a lot of the information we have shows that parental influences and parental behavior impacts kids and teens a lot more than I think parents think they do. And then we talk a little bit about what you can do. We recap the information, and then we have room for some Q&A at the end. And if any of you all have questions as we go through the material, since this is a pretty small group, you can feel free to ask them. And then if we need to start bumping them to the end at any point, we'll do that if we need to because of time. So let's start with the taking a look at the substance landscape on Staten Island. So we usually, ask the community, whoever we're presenting, what do you think are the top substances being used right now? When we ask this to youth, they usually say cannabis, right? And they'll usually say weed, pot, right? Like That's usually what they say. And if we move forward to the next slide and look at the numbers, we do see that marijuana is pretty high, pretty relatively pretty high up there. It's just under vaping and just under drinking, which is interesting because a lot of people, when you ask about drugs, whether they're adults or youth, don't really culturally consider alcohol as a drug, even though scientifically it is, because of the impacts it has on the brain and its intoxicating properties. So that's something we usually point out when we're doing presentations. And then, we look at some of the other substances that have lower usage rates than drinking, vaping, and marijuana, but are still significant. Like, for example, we have, and this has gone up, in the time they did the survey, 12.1% of youth reported using painkillers, in the past year. We also see harder drugs like cocaine, heroin, and drug by injection. Those are all pretty high, right? And we see a rise in heroin, particularly between 2017 and 2019. So these are something, and when we deliver this, we're not about scare tactics, right? We're not trying to scare parents and caregivers, but we want to make them aware that these are substances that are circulating, right? And making themselves available to kids in our community. Next slide. So traditionally, when we looked at how drug use progresses, right, from one substance to another, there used to be kind of a predictable ladder that it would take. But then if you add over-the-counter drugs into the picture, right, once over-the-counter drugs, particularly opiates, started becoming more common on Staten Island, we saw a jump from once somebody was unable to get those prescription opiates, a jump to drugs like heroin, meth, and crack. So the progression to those heavier drugs would happen quicker, right? There used to be a slower progression. Now we saw this jump from prescription drugs, right, to things like heroin. And part of what has made this even more scary in recent years is the way which fentanyl has been circulated, in these street drugs, right? In heroin, meth, and crack. And fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, and it's many times stronger, than heroin and morphine, and it's deadlier. Many overdoses do involve fentanyl. So the fact that this fentanyl has started to be circulated in the street drug market, and the fact that these street drugs started becoming more common, after there were stopgaps put in place to get the prescription opiates, made the problem all the more deadly and concerning. So next slide. So we also do want to acknowledge in the presentation the data we have about some of the reasons why youth might turn to a substance. As many of us know, if we look at the drug ladder presented in the previous slide, not everybody goes up the drug ladder, right? Some people go up to liquor and marijuana and stop there, right? But there's just certain risk factors, right? That can make certain people data-wise, bigger picture-wise, a little bit more vulnerable, to possibly either reaching the point of abuse, with things like liquor or marijuana, or going even higher up the ladder, right? So these factors on this slide are some of the primary factors that came up that, you know, when surveys have been done with youth, saying like these are some of the reasons why they've turned to a substance. And when we say availability of drugs and alcohol, that factor I think is really important for parents and caregivers to hear, because a lot of times that availability can be in the home, right? You know, using your parents' liquor, like trying your parents' pills. So we definitely recommend having any of these substances locked up for parents. And we do have, which I think we get into later in the presentation, information about, you know, say a parent like went through a surgery, right, or had an injury. They were taking prescription opiates for a while. They felt better, they finished, and there's just opiates laying around, right? There's places you can go on Staten Island to drop those off, right, safely. And, you know, that's part of, you know, what we really want to kind of drill to parents, just the importance of not having these accessible to their teens. We also emphasize that the pandemic exacerbated, you know, a lot of these concerns, particularly around things like, you know, friendships, you know, and how social lives were changed, and particularly around school and grades, you know, that became more stressful for people, you know, when things switched virtually. And we also emphasize that dating and relationships, right, you know, can play a role in this. So maybe if, you know, there's a recent breakup, there's more of a risk. And also more than 1 in 5 youth on Staten Island reported using drugs or alcohol before their last sexual encounter. That's huge, because once you're intoxicated, you really can't, you're not in a position to give consent, right? So that opens the door to, you know, being involved in a whole other set of risky behavior. So those are some of the things that we point out on this slide. Moving forward. So when we talk about vaping, one of the things, you know, whether we're talking to kids or to parents in the community, that we try to really drill down and focus on is the marketing techniques, right, involved in vaping, because youth are responsive to that. You know, youth do not want to, they care about money, you know, they don't want to feel like they're being taken advantage of. And in a lot of way, the companies, I mean, if you look at the techniques and the way they market a lot of these vaping products, they are meant to be flashy and attractive towards youth. And they use branding that's similar for like snacks and cereals and other things that target youth. And of course there are health risks, right? I mean, you know, it increases the risk of smoking cigarettes, you know, the data is now saying. It increases the risk of like injuries and poisoning when you're using these devices, and you get exposure to they have nicotine in them, right, a lot of these. So you're still getting that exposure to an addictive substance. Vaping cannabis, you know, is increasingly common as well. And it's trendy now, you know, among a lot of youth. It's trendy. And it's still so new. There's a lot more consequences we potentially don't know yet. So, you know, we usually make the parents and the youth aware of all of that. And if we look at data around vaping, about how Staten Island compares to the rest of New York City, we say that there's more vaping here than the New York City average, right? And we see that a lot of kids here are able to get them in stores, you know, even though it's not legal, they're still getting their hands on them, or they're borrowing it from somebody else. So it's something that, you know, you'll see roughly, you know, 1 in 5 teens here say yes, they've vaped in the past 30 days. So vaping is definitely an important conversation to have. And then if we look at alcohol, so some of the things we want to really kind of get across to parents are alcohol is a drug, right? And even though it has been highly normalized in our culture, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the healthiest choice for them. And there's a lot around the lack of judgment that happens when you're intoxicating. That could be that could end up in really stressful consequences for the teen, right? There is, if they are old enough to drive, the consequences of intoxicated driving could be, not only potentially deadly or injurious, but they could have a lot of legal costs associated with it, right? They'll probably be mandated to go to some kind of treatment, even if they don't want to, right? So there's a lot of ways that, particularly the driving issue can harm them, and even if they don't drive or they're not old enough to drive, there is, if they're seen intoxicated in public, social media creates like a permanent record of their decisions. And a lot of these teens are, at a point where they're trying to, start to do things like look for jobs, right? Get into colleges, and the way they present themselves, is ultimately important. And alcohol can, get in the way of all of those things. So really kind of, and of course there's long-term health risks, right? Which definitely should be mentioned. But, I think what really lands with teens is like, this is also, in addition to the long-term risks, like these are also things that can happen in the short term that will probably make your life more stressful. So next slide. So cannabis or marijuana, it is possible to become dependent on marijuana. So that's an important point to drive. It doesn't mean that everybody will, but some people do become dependent on it. And even though, it's, similar to alcohol now, it is legal to use once you are 21. That doesn't always mean it's, the best choice for people. We look at rates of past day marijuana use, similar to alcohol use, maybe slightly less, but not very much. It's very normalized, in youth culture at this point. And then there are, similar to alcohol, there are long-term risks of it. There's also short-term memory, which is a more immediate risk of right after usage impacting your short-term memory. And, a lot of teens are at the point, where they are doing things, like I said, applying for college, right? Trying to get a job, learning to drive. They're in the middle of a lot of, or approaching some pretty big transitional things that it's important for them to have their A game on. And if they're smoking pot regularly, or using cannabis regularly, how in whatever method, now that edibles are becoming increasingly common too, it's good, just to make them aware that frequent use of this can really prevent them, right, from being on their A game and kind of showing their potential, in all of these things that they are trying to do. So that's usually some of the cannabis points, that we drive home. Also, if this is being delivered to youth who are old enough to purchase cannabis, but their brain's not still fully developed yet. So maybe like the 21 to 24 age range, there's no legal cannabis places open on Staten Island yet. Everything that's open here is just kind of an illegal pop shop, right? So it is important to the only legal dispensaries open in New York State right now there's one in Manhattan, the Housing Works dispensary. That's it. And the reason why that's significant is sometimes these illegal places are not always transparent. They're not bound by the same regulations to be transparent about the THC content in their material, in their like their edibles and stuff. So sometimes you can get it's similar to like getting it on the street in the way like that you don't know the exact strength of it, right? So you could potentially get a lot higher that you intended, which that could cause problems. Okay, so next slide. So let's take a look at prescription drugs, for a few minutes. So we have, there's different categories of prescription drugs. There are, oh, Sean, can you minimize the presenter notes? Sorry, it's just, I can't see the slide. Cool, thanks. There are pain relievers, like Vicodin, OxyContin, Percocet. These are the opiate-based pain relievers. If somebody's, and we try to just let parents know how to recognize if somebody's under the intoxication of them, because they may not be familiar with this. If somebody's under the influence of any of these, they'll possibly be nauseous or vomiting, will likely exhibit, some amount of drowsiness, sometimes diarrhea, sometimes having bone and muscle pain. They may be more impatient than usual, and if they've had a lot of it, they might have loss of consciousness, which is a great reason for everybody to be trained in Narcan, right? Because that can reverse that process. There's also stimulants, Adderall, Ritalin. Some people are prescribed this for ADHD. It is also abused by people who are not prescribed it. Under stimulants, you'll see that people usually have an increased heart rate, maybe breathing heavier than usual, may appear more nervousness or jittery, or even paranoid in some circumstances. And then there are benzodiazepines, sedatives, and tranquilizers. Examples are Xanax and Valium. Again, some people are prescribed this, as a way to manage anxiety and de-escalate panic attacks. If somebody is abusing them, what you might see is, appearing more slowed than usual, having more difficulty concentrating, and may have less coordination than usual. So those are just signs to recognize of intoxication in all of those. And then moving forward, we do talk about heroin. Right? Heroin is an opioid, and it's just used in it's used in several different forms. It can be snorted, it can be smoked, although that's not as common, or it can be injected. And the symptoms are usually similar, to the symptoms of somebody under prescription opiates. You have the drowsiness, the mental fogginess, dry mouth, is, more common with heroin. And probably the scariest thing is somebody can stop breathing, right? Which is, again, something that, Narcan, if administered quickly and on the spot, can reverse. And then the health risks of heroin are pretty significant. Opiates are highly addictive. If you are using injection, as a way to take opiates, it puts you at higher risk for bloodborne illnesses such as HIV and hepatitis C. And now we're having the additional complication of it being laced with fentanyl. So highly, highly, highly risky. And sadly, we did see the lifetime use go up by quite a bit on Staten Island, and it's almost double the rate, of the rest of the city. So this is a significant problem here. So we want to make sure it's included in the education, that we give to parents and caregivers. All right, next slide. And then there's methamphetamines. Again, similar to heroin, look at this use of lifetime use of methamphetamines next to the rest of the city. It's happening on Staten Island. And meth is a stimulant. It results in feelings of euphoria, an initial rush of that, right after it's taken. But then that transitions into being kind of on edge, sometimes angry, irritable, sometimes scared. When on meth, people will usually have a decreased appetite, sometimes have paranoia and confusion. Their breathing, will likely be rapid and irregular. And if somebody's taking meth regularly, you might see some rotting teeth, get thinner, and have new acne or sores, and possibly intense scratching. Again, it's highly addictive. If you are taking meth via injection, puts you at the same risk as, taking heroin via injection, HIV/AIDS, hepatitis C. We also do see fentanyl in meth as well. So very similar to, heroin in terms of the risks. Next slide. And then of course there is, fentanyl. If somebody's under the risk of fentanyl, you will see the drowsiness and confusion, that you tend to see with opiates. In addition to that, some things unique to fentanyl are you might see the pupils become really small. Sometimes constipation is associated with it. You'll also see the slow breathing, sometimes nausea and vomiting. If somebody, uses fentanyl over a longer period of time, some of the health effects are pretty severe constipation. They may develop breathing problems during their sleep. It puts them at higher risk of heart attack and heart failure, and it suppresses the immune system. So they're more susceptible to various kinds of illnesses. Next slide. Okay, so at this note, I'm going to pitch it to Sean, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of the points we drilled to parents and caregivers about why they matter in this conversation. So take it away, Sean.
Thanks, Ashley. So yeah, at this point, we really tried to get across the importance a parent or caregiver can play, that our surveying has shown, and from research we understand that parents can be very influential. 95% of adults on Staten Island, when we've surveyed them, believe that they can play a role if they do try to intervene in a young person's potential using. And so we want to really encourage and empower parents and caregivers to use that leverage that they potentially have, right? And not let an opportunity go by without sort of seizing that. We've also heard from young people that 55% of high school youth say that their parents have not had that conversation, right? So while on the one hand, adults are saying that they think they can really have that impact, but our young people, a slight majority of young people are saying they're not hearing that from parents. And so we really want to see those 95% of parents really doing that work that they know that they can do, and beyond. So we really want to emphasize at this point that taking action during teenage years is particularly important. 9 out of 10 people who have a challenge with drug or alcohol use started using as a teen, and so really this is the time to have an impact on them, right? So though 9 out of 10 began as a teenager, a child who gets through those teenage years without misusing really has the opportunity to develop as an adult without that substance use challenge, right? And we use this sort of seesaw diagram to sort of illustrate what this relationship looks like. So when a young person, starting from the left here, when a young person understands that there's a high risk of using that substance and understands that it will not meet approval from their family or trusted adults, right? There's a lower chance of substance use. While on the other hand, when a young person does not fully understand the risks of that substance and does not believe that it will meet disapproval in the home, that finding out that I use cannabis, for example, then there's a higher chance that that person will use a substance, right? So the most important takeaway here is make sure your children or the young people you care for know that you don't want them to use substances. And so this here's an example of a campaign that we've done at TYSA in the past around alcohol to, really make parents and adults understand just how casually we talk about alcohol use and how we normalize it when we speak so casually about it. So for instance, you see on here, I need a few drinks to loosen up, or I'm not drunk enough to dance. Football games just aren't the same without a nice cold beer. You know, when we use that sort of language around our young people, it really frames alcohol as an essential part of activities, essential part of the daily life, and we want to be mindful of what we're saying and really try to model a different sort of culture among our young people. So and I'd love to hear what you all think, but we often ask parents and caregivers and young people themselves, when is the brain fully developed? Anybody have a guess?
Hi, Sean. I guess I don't know, early 20s.
Well, so you're on the right track. 24, 25. Some researchers even as late as 26. So definitely, yeah, in those mid 20s. And I think that's really important that we emphasize with our young people, and for parents to understand, right? Because I think it can explain a lot, right? The part of the brain that develops fully, the part of the brain that develops last is this decision-making center of our brains, and um, it not being fully developed can explain why sometimes teenagers are making risky decisions, not fully contemplating the consequences of their decisions, and so they need to be mindful of that they have a fuller potential that they could alter by using substances and introducing them into their usage.
I'm assuming, Sean, sorry to interrupt. I'm assuming that means
Please.
like in all decision making, right? Like the brain isn't fully developed until he's at 24, 25. So pretty much any decision they're making about themselves may be affected by the fact that they're fully developed, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks, John. So, and Ashley talked a little bit about some risk factors that we want to be mindful of, but there are also other vulnerabilities that some folks may have that we need to be, particularly mindful of, because it could put them at an increased risk for substance use. So people that have been exposed to trauma, people who have a family member who's had a history of challenges with substance use, people who may have learning impairments or identify as LGBTQ+, and as well as depression and a number of other factors. But there are protective factors that can really mitigate these risks, and we certainly want to take some time to talk about that. So one protective factor, particularly when we're talking about our younger ones, is social emotional learning. And so social emotional learning really focuses on building these 5 competencies for a young person: social awareness, self-awareness, relationship skills, self-management, and responsible decision-making. Our coalition has done a lot of work on social emotional learning implementation. We've worked with over about 125 teachers borough-wide to provide them the social emotional learning curriculum and really implement a culture change in their classroom where they're creating positive, fostering cooperation among young people, and really building the skills for a young person in their future to be able to not engage in substance use, tell their peer who might be pressuring them to use no, and feel confident that they're still a good friend to that person or what have you, right? And really confident in themselves. And so that's one protective factor we've really worked on in the coalition. But there's a number of other things that you can do, and just maybe you don't have a younger child in your life, but maybe you have a young adult, and that doesn't mean that that there is not prevention work that you can be doing with your young one, or with your youth and young adults in general. So we created a sort of like 7-step pledge that sort of makes it a little bit easier to remember. We call it taking actions, right? So ask, connect, talk, inform, organize, Narcan, secure. And I'll quickly go through this. So one, ask your child's doctor. Don't be afraid to ask questions of your doctors, right? And understand medications that they're being prescribed, understand if there are alternatives available, and what interactions you need to be mindful of. All of those questions should really feel empowered to ask your doctor these questions, so you can be prepared and you can ensure your child or young person that you care for is prepared for the risks. And we really encourage people to make time to connect with their young people in their lives. And life's hectic, and that can be really challenging to do, but you want to look for opportunities to connect with them, right? Checking in with them daily, asking them how their day was, having routines with them where you maybe regularly go to a movie or watch a show together, and also those then, from those opportunities, there will be sort of natural opportunities where you can then have conversations around substance use. For instance, we have some TYSA youth in our youth groups that have watched Euphoria with a parent, and Euphoria, for folks that don't know, is like a HBO series that really is about substance use and many other issues, but young people, and there's a lot of substance use in it. And it became a natural way to have the conversation with that young person about what they know about substances. And so use those opportunities as a teachable moment. And to that teachable moment, right, talk to them about the dangers of prescription medications, that just because it's prescribed by a doctor does not mean that this is a completely harmless pill, that there are risks and there are expectations on how to use them. And that means you have to be informed, right? And so there are tools online, like WebMD has a drug interaction checker where you can look up multiple medications, ensure that they have no side effects that you need to really be on the lookout for. And don't be afraid to ask your pharmacist or your doctor if you have questions as well. And get organized in your community. There's a lot of stigma around substance use and mental health challenges, and TYSA as a coalition, we really try to do work to chip away at that stigma and make a more compassionate culture in our community where we can really support one another and you know, see the behavioral health of young people, but all of us improve. And so we try to encourage parents and caregivers to also get involved. We have many community events throughout the year, trainings and what have you. So there's a lot of opportunities for folks that have the capacity. We really try to encourage folks to get Narcan trained. It is an incredibly quick and easy training to have, and you know, what a opportunity if you can, you know, potentially save someone's life, right? And just I think last year we were able to train about 350 folks. We're able to get the kits sent to folks by mail. And so we have a QR code here, and we'd really try to encourage folks to do so, to, again, potentially reverse that opioid overdose. And lastly, the S in our actions is secure. And Ashley touched on this a little, but just the point that, you know, we often get prescribed pills. We we don't finish the whole cycle. We might leave them in the medicine cabinet, and then they, you know, they're forgotten about. And if they're forgotten about, it means you may not notice when they're no longer there, right? And so when we no longer need these pills, it's smart and safe to just simply dispose of them. There's drop boxes across the borough, in all of our precincts, in many of our pharmacies, and even our local hospital systems have them. They're completely anonymous. There's no questions asked. You just drop them in. But then we also want to secure other things we have in the home: alcohol, cannabis, and if there are prescription pills that you actively use and need, they can still be, you know, safely secured in your home somewhere where young people don't have access to. So quickly, just recapping: ask your doctor those questions, connect with your child as much as possible, talk to a pharmacist or another healthcare provider about the risks of any prescriptions your young one's taking. Remain informed on how they interact with one another. Organize with folks in your community. Get Narcan trained, and secure those medications or other substances in the home. And you folks can also sign the pledge. It's on the bottom right here. We try to encourage folks who take this training to sign the pledge. That's basically stating that you will commit to do these actions with any young, any parents or you will do these steps with any young people in your lives to prevent substance use. And of course, you know, when we're talking to folks in the community, we want them to know all that does exist. You know, when you're in a crisis, or a young person you care about in your life is in crisis, you don't want to have to be looking around for where the help is. You want to know where to go and who to turn to. So there are resources nationwide. There are really some dedicated community partners here locally, and well, some of you are joining us today. And but there's also a lot of school resources that are available. If there's a school-based health center or a SAPIS in your school, it's important to know about them and use those resources when you need them. And then on the bottom right, there's a QR code which has which would pull up a guide of all mental health and substance use providers island-wide, and it's a really great resource to share with folks. And we also have physical copies we can provide partners or community organizations. So there was a lot there. We want to pause and give some time for some questions. Yeah, just thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Ashley and Sean. This was a very interesting presentation, and I learned a lot. Particularly about the fact that, uh, again, a child's brain or a person's brain isn't fully developed until they're 25, or at least the decision-making part of the brain. It just kind of opens up doors to questions for other things, like what else are they making decisions on that they may not be really developmentally prepared to make. I also like the part of the presentation where you mentioned that I don't want to say disapproval, but a parent's opinion on substance use and alcohol use really helps deter their children from engaging in those activities. I mean, that was great because, like as an adult that cares for children, my niece and nephew, and hopefully I'll be a parent soon. It means a lot to know that my opinion does matter and can affect and help my child make the right decisions.
Yeah, thanks, John. Great. So Caitlin, I know you joined a minute or two late, but just want to make sure did you have any questions for us about any of it?
No, thank you so much. Thank you for
Of
the
course.
presentation.
Anytime. We had mentioned in the beginning, so just want to remind folks, we're going to share out the slideshow for this. So feel free to deliver this to parents or caregivers that you engage with, any of your clients. Certainly, if you do, we'd love to hear how many folks you reached, how it went, because that's it all feeds back into the coalition and it's really valuable for us. But then also, Ashley and I want to make ourselves available to also co-deliver it with either of you, any of you, if you ever want to. So
Thank you very much.
cool. So I'm going to stop our recording.